Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you guys an update on my elephant foot vine. So it's been several months since the last update. I think the last update was around about October, November time. Basically this was back in its growing phase, putting on lots of new vines, getting all its leaves ready to absorb all the energy over winter. Now it's the middle of summer, well just towards the end of summer, and it's been dormant now probably for about 4 or 5 months. I think it was about March or April that it finished with its growth, and it's now the beginning of August, so it's completely dormant. But now is a great time to show you how much the cortex has grown, see what kind of growth it's had. It's also a great time for me to repot it whilst it's still dormant, and there are signs it's just starting to come out of dormancy, so I need to get this done now before it's growing again, because once it's in growth it's very hard to repot it because the stems are so delicate, they're very easy to snap, so now would be a great time to do that. So I'll just zoom in a little bit to give you a bit more detail on the actual tuber itself. This is how it is now. I now put up a photo about 9 months from about 9 months ago when it was just starting to come into growth, and you should be able to see it has grown quite a bit since then. Basically, the bits that are slightly green on the photo are the bits that are actively growing, and those bits eventually become brown and then they become barky sections of the cortex. So what you can see now is growth rings, and the darker the growth rings, it tends to be the slower it's grown. So if I zoom right in here, you can see this year it has actually grown quite a bit more than it has in previous years. The last 2 or 3 years, basically, it had all these tiny little growth sections. You can see that especially well on the left section. Basically, it had grown very fast the first few years I had it. It started off around here because it was a complete circle when I bought it. So it grew quite fast through these sections. Then what happened is it was on a windowsill. It was struggling for space. Basically, I didn't have enough space in my old flat for it. It was in a small pot, not enough space for it to grow, and it kept getting attacked by pests like thrips and aphids. So I had 2 or 3 years here where it was growing quite slow, and then if you look, the most recent one is right next to the crevice here. Basically, the closer to the crevice, the more recent the growth. And you can see the last section is grown almost a centimetre, and it's nice and clear, light colour, so that means it's quite fast growth. And it does vary depending on where on the tuber you look. Some sections of the tuber tends to grow faster than others, so you can see up the top here, particularly fast growing section there. Turn it around, this section as well. This is probably the section that's grown the most, so it doesn't grow evenly. It does have areas which grow faster than others, so as you can see that's a section that's grown quite quickly. Coming around here, again this area has all grown a lot in the last year, but then you've got other sections like here where they've put on very little growth. So the tuber will change its shape over time. They tend to be very circular and round when they're very young plants, and then they kind of flatten out over time. Mine hasn't started to flatten out yet, but it will eventually, and it'll become more of a flat shape instead of this round ball that we have at the moment. And it also changes how angular these lumps are coming out from the top. Basically every single one's different. I think it depends partly on genetics, partly on growing conditions. Each cortex looks completely unique for every plant. It's almost like a fingerprint, and it basically gives the history of the plant. So the history of the plant is shown in the lines. You can tell how well and how fast it's grown in previous years. And then the actual kind of plates that it has, the growing plates, they tend to split up over time. So you can see these cracks starting to appear here. These will split and become, well, they'll appear to become smaller, but they'll actually stay about the same size. They'll just become more numerous, so they can completely cover the whole cortex, you know, these growing plates. Some of them might start off quite small like this, and they get bigger over time. Once they get really large, like this growing plate here, they'll then start to split into smaller growing plates, and then become large and just more numerous, basically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to repot it. So I'm going to repot it. It's currently in a 3-litre pot. I'm going to upgrade it to a 5-litre pot, so it's quite a bit more space, but it's not a massive upgrade. I'll probably just have this in a year or two, and I'll probably upgrade it again because it does seem to be quite fast growing at the moment, and so I reckon this will only last a year or two, and then I'll need to upgrade it again into probably a 10-litre pot, something like that. So what I did notice on this is there's a tiny bit of growth which has started to grow, but then it's not really continued, it's just kind of died off. So I've not seen that before. I think it's trying to come out of dormancy, but it's been so hot in the conservatory it's sort of struggling. So I'm not too sure what I'm going to do with it. I could always give it much colder conditions and then it would come into growth again. But my worry is I don't have anywhere with enough space with cold conditions. The conservatory is the best place for it, but it's currently too hot in there because it's summer. I'm trying to keep it hot for my tropical plants. So I'm going to repot this now, but I'm going to keep it quite dry. At the moment only been giving it a tiny bit of water every month or two, just to give it a tiny bit of moisture so the Cordex doesn't dry out completely. You don't really want to water this at all when it's in its dormant phase, otherwise it will just rot and you'll lose the whole plant. So I've been keeping it dry and dormant and very hot over the summertime. I've been keeping it in the shade though. It doesn't like to be baked in the sunshine. The Cordex will get too hot and actually get cooked. But the temperatures have been around 30 most days, about 20 at night. But on very hot sunny days in the conservatory it's probably been getting close to 40 degrees, and that just puts it straight into dormancy. So when I do repot it, I'm going to keep it dry for another month. Come September, when the temperatures start cooling down, and I'll reduce the heating level in the conservatory and start putting my tropical plants into their dormant period. This will be coming out of dormancy, and so I'll start watering it. And if I do see any strong growth coming through, even in the hot weather, then I'll start watering it lots and just allow it to grow if it does want to grow. Although elephant foot vines in the wild are naturally dormant in the summer period, when you grow them at home, because it's an artificial environment and the climate isn't exactly like it would be in South Africa where this comes from, the dormant period can be quite random. Normally for me, I do find though it starts growing around October time and then goes dormant March, April time, and then it's completely dormant all summer. But it does vary by a few months every year, and certainly when they're young plants they can grow for 2 or 3 years without having any dormant period. So it is quite random, but it does generally try and match up with your winter wherever you are in the world. But if you're in a tropical area where you don't really have a winter, I suspect they'll be completely random as to when this goes dormant, and you just have to follow what the plant wants to do. If you try and force it into growth too early and you start watering it, you'll get rot starting to set in. With these plants, they're very susceptible to rot. Basically, they grow in very dry, arid conditions in the wild, and they just get rain in the winter months, which is why they grow in the winter months. So what I'll do now is I'll show you the soil mixture I'll be using. So this is the soil mixture I'm going to use when I'm repotting this plant. It's basically the same as what it's growing in at the moment, and it's about 50% perlite. That's the white sections in this soil mix. The perlite is extremely free draining, and this is to help recreate what it grows in the wild. And the rest of the substrate, which is maybe about 40 to 50%, is a loam-based, soil-based compost. Basically John Innes number 3. There's a tiny bit of organic matter in there, but not an awful lot. It's mainly just a loam-based soil, just to give it some moisture retention and also somewhere for the nutrients to hold on to and stay in the compost. Whereas the perlite is very free draining and it holds very little nutrients, very little water, so you need something else in there just to give the plant the nutrients and the water it needs. So what this grows in the wild is basically kind of like gravel. It's just very poor soil, very sandy. Lots of shale rock and just gravel basically and stones. So it's very free draining, so it doesn't really have to worry about waterlogging. That's why it's so badly adapted to wet soils. If you give it a high organic content soil that holds a lot of water, you'll just lose the roots. They'll start rotting off. So that's why I've gone for a very free draining soil. Lots of perlite for having it free draining, and I've gone for the John Innes because it prefers a soil-based compost. Where it grows in the wild, there's almost no organic matter in the soil, so you don't want a high organic matter soil. You just want something that's got a tiny bit of organic matter, but it's mostly inorganic, such as gravels or sand. So I'll quickly take the plant out now and show you the root system. I checked it earlier, it's actually looking quite good. It's interesting to see that the roots don't completely die back. I thought maybe the roots might be deciduous, a bit like the stems are, but no, the roots are actually completely alive. You can still see they haven't dried out or anything. They're looking very healthy, and even some of these smaller roots, I do wonder if these are actually still alive. It's kind of hard to tell. They might be dried out, but certainly the thicker ones have survived. So what I'm going to do is I'm not actually going to remove any of these old roots. I'm just going to keep them where they are. I'm just going to keep the old soil. Normally when I'm repotting plants, I often replace the soil, but because this doesn't like a high organic content, and it's the organic content that breaks down in the soil, the loss of organic content in this old soil isn't a big issue. So I'll just leave it as it is and just plant around it and keep that old soil. There are quite a few roots in here, but there's not an excessive amount of roots, so I'll be keeping the old soil for now. Only other thing I'll be doing is increasing the soil height slightly. The soil did sink over time, and you can see some of these roots are kind of exposed out of the air now. And I never want to really bury up too close to the cordex. If you bury the cordex, that's when you're really going to start having problems with rot. You want to have the cordex as dry as possible. So what I'm going to do is just bury it a tiny bit deeper, and then if I feel like it's still a bit too high, I might just mulch with a bit of perlite or gravel, something that's really free draining so the water doesn't hold there. But what I found in the past, even though the roots start growing from the outside of the cordex, even if they're not close to the soil, what they tend to do is they just grow through the air, especially as I've got quite high humidity in winter in my conservatory, and they just go straight into the compost. This could be an issue if you had low humidity. The roots might die before they get to the compost, but I found they've always been fine, and they come out like they just kind of come down as stilts and grow into the soil. That way I've got no worry about rot in the cordex. But I do want to give it a little bit more support, because I'm worried if the whole thing's supported by roots, it might snap, especially as it gets heavier. So I need to have a little bit of something underneath there just to support the weight. So I'm just going to check the depth of the pot there. It's not too far off. I don't have to add too much to the bottom of the pot to increase the height. So I just want to bring it up a little bit higher so that I'm not burying this too deep in that new compost. So that looks about the right height, especially as I'm going to be wanting to add a little bit more compost just to cover up those bare roots. Now fortunately, being such a loose soil mix, it's very easy to put the soil around, so it shouldn't be hard at all for me to put the soil in and around the compost, even though it's quite narrow and there's not enough space between the pot and the root ball to get the soil in. So I'm just going to go around, carefully fill this all in. So I'm not wanting to compact the soil too much, but I just want to make sure there's no massive air gaps in there. So I'm just going to gently push it down with a trowel, but just incredibly gently, because it needs to be a free draining soil. If there's any compaction, the roots will struggle to grow through it, and it could lead to just less water flowing through. So I'll just give it a little shake there as well. You can see that's helped the soil settle down, so I can just continue to fill it up. So that's the elephant foot vine now planted to about the depth I was wanting. You can see it hasn't got those kind of stilt-like roots coming out the bottom, but the soil is only just going up to the edge. You can almost see a little bit of a gap there where it's just above the soil. So what I'm going to do now is just leave it, not give it any water, see if it comes into growth. When it does come into growth, I'll then give it a good watering and allow it to grow, and I'll probably do an update when that happens. When it comes to the compost, this will probably settle slightly over time, especially when I give it the first watering. Normally when I'm repotting plants, I give them a good soak after they've been repotted. The soil then sinks down and then I can top up further. But with this, if I give it a good soak now, with it being dormant, it will just probably lead to root rot or even the tuber dying off and rotting. So I can't give this a soak now, so when I do give it its first watering, I'll then probably top this up as the compost will probably sink. And I'll probably see you guys in a few months' time. It shouldn't be too long. As I said, there is a little bit of sign of something starting to happen with the growth, so I think it's starting to want to come out of dormancy, but it's just a little bit too hot. So probably sometime around October time, maybe November, just depends when it comes into growth again. I'll give you guys another update, and we should expect a lot more growth than last year. The tuber's a good size bigger, there's a lot more nutrients and energy stored up in there, so it should grow into quite a large plant.